This is Ted Cooley doing lecture number 6 for a dialogue with Zen's book, People's History of the United States. We're doing chapters 11 and 12 today. Beginning with chapter 11 of this dialogue with his book. In the 30 years from 1870 to 1900, there were 3 bank panics. For both urban and rural America, the pressure on the lower middle and lower class was enormous. With a very large immigration underway from Southern and Eastern Europe, there were more seeking employment than there were jobs available. In 1859, as an illustration, it took 61 hours of labor to produce 1 acre of wheat. In 1900, it took 3 hours. In 1859, there were no steel rails on the railroads of the United States. In 1865, Carnegie had the main line of his railroad in steel rails from the Atlantic to the Ohio Valley. Other similar improvements in productivity and management took place in the North during the Civil War, often eclipsed from history by the violence of the war. In the early fall of 1863, a Union army became isolated at Chattanooga, Tennessee. Though not surrounded, all the routes for supplies were cut off. Making use of the power of the developing railroads, the Union Army transported 2 Army Corps, 20,000 soldiers from the Virginia front to the Tennessee River by rail in a matter of 4 or 5 days. This level of troop movement had never before even been considered. This is simply one example of the massive changes taking place in the North while a major war was underway. All of these industrial changes, whether in manufacturing or agriculture, required fewer people to produce as much or more product than before. At the same time, there was a massive influx of immigrants, primarily from Southern and Eastern Europe. With a decrease of employees needed to produce and an increase in immigration at the same time, obviously, there are more persons seeking work than available jobs. The resulting social unrest took 2 forms: strikes and work stoppages with significant violence in urban areas and farmer protests in rural areas. Zen devotes the larger emphasis to the urban areas, but also during this time there were 3 bank panics from the freewheeling banking industry, resulting in even more social dislocation. Zen reports from 1881 to 1885, strikes had averaged about 500 each year. In 1886, there were over 1,400 strikes involving 500,000 workers. The one legal outlet for this tension would have been the ballot box. The problem was a necessity of land ownership on the tax rolls in many of the states in order to vote. Thus, a legal option for change was presented. The industrial unrest clearly had Marxist overtones, though it would have happened, as it did in the 1830s, without the writings of Marx. This produced extremes of rhetoric which only fueled the fear among government authorities. Thus, combat between protesters, strikers, and anti-government forces and the opposing National Guard, police, and army fueled many historical situations which Zen emphasizes. On the other hand, one of the enduring items of this industrial society was the emphasis in the curriculum of the public schools to prepare students for the industrial world. Thus, loyalty to the government, teacher certification, and patriotism was placed in schools to ensure cooperative students would turn into loyal workers for the new system. One possible positive from all this activity was the joining of various ethnic groups to be united as one in the protests and strikes, though inclusion of Blacks was still the exception, though not unknown. At the same time, and this is part of the history that Zen seems to overlook, there was increasing pressure on the small farmer with a very high debt load. Bankruptcies and hard times were throughout the agricultural community. However, the farmer on his land and the local merchant in the community had the right to vote, as this was tied to the land, despite the mortgage on it. Thus, the direction of change coming from the farming community took a different direction than that of the industrialized community, not reaching fruition in the time covered in this chapter, but resulting in a new political landscape in the next decades. And perhaps this is the more important historically in terms of the changes. According to Lawrence Goodwin in his book, The Populist Movement, quote, the Populist Revolt, the most elaborate example of mass insurgency we have in American history, provides an abundant evidence, unquote, in democratic movement building. During the 1880s, the National Farmers Alliance developed a mass recruitment system which became the world's first large-scale working class cooperative. By 1880, 25% of farmers had lost their land and were only tenants on what they had previously owned as a result of the business practices of both banks and those grain and cotton buyers upon which the farmer depended. Starting in the South, the local organization built organization to the Dakotas and eventually in many, if not most states. They wanted more money in circulation as the growth of the economy was so great following the Civil War that the real value of the gold available did not meet the needs of business. Hence the push for silver or silver notes, which only went out in the last 20 years. Not only easier money, but farmer co-ops, and this is a movement which continues to this day, were developed to better represent both mass purchases and joint sales of farm commodities. Their organization, training, and sharing of economic resources and ideas provided emphasis to enter the political world as well. In 1889, and this is a folk tale, a branch of the Alliance elected officials to the Kansas legislature. And it is reported that, quote, stockless, unquote, Jerry Simpson, one of the organizers, suggested to the farmers in, I think, Winfield, Kansas, that the farmers should raise less corn and more hay. In the Dakotas, the co-ops expanded to offer farmers insurance. The growth of the movement was such that by 1890, there were 38 Alliance people in the Congress of the United States. The Alliance convention that year in Topeka expressed a clear program of reforms needed both by agricultural and industrial workers, though the Alliance never was able to gather the industrial contacts it needed for further expansion. By 1892, the Alliance formally offered a populist presidential candidate. One interesting development in the South was noted, quote, never before or since have the two races in the South come so close together as they did during the populist struggles. Perhaps this today could be good news as to what can be accomplished. By 1896, the movement was grabbed by the Democratic Party with William Jennings Bryan and his Cross of Gold speech. However, the demanded changes were well articulated for the future. Chapter 12. Zinn records 10 military interventions by the United States between 1852 and 1884. This includes the forced, formidable opening of Japan to the West for commerce. Some of these invasions by the Marines extended as far south as Argentina. Zinn actually minimizes the record of the tendency of the United States to exert its power beyond its borders. One of the motivations of the War of 1812 was to capture Canada to add it to the United States. Andrew Jackson's presence in Florida in 1817 was a factor in the foreign government's decision to sell to the United States. In the 1820s and 30s, to move into Texas to increase slavery territory was intentional in the minds of some, an attempt to add it to the United States for the production of cotton. An aggressive expansionist, this group is called filibusters, and a number of them tried to grab much of Latin America to add to the United States. The expansionist, one William Walker, who's on the chart here, invaded Sonora, the state in Mexico right south of Arizona, in 1853 to add it to the United States. Failing this, he occupied parts of Baja California for some time before being forced back to California. By 1855, he was in Nicaragua fomenting revolution, actually becoming president of that country for parts of 1856 and 1857. The apparent intent was his activity to add this territory to the slavery complex. He was finally executed by the government of Honduras in 1860 after trying to take over that country. And he was only the most famous of several of these filibusters trying to grab Latin America or parts of it to expand the slave empire. The California Republic, 1848, was established for only a short time before the Mexican War grabbed all of northern Mexico anyway. Farmers entered the Oregon Territory about the same time, even though Hudson's Bay Company was being in charge. Even before the Spanish-American War, the need for coaling stations for the Navy entered the military planning. Hence, we still have American Samoa and Guantanamo Bay, both established as coaling stations. This tendency to extend power by questionable means has not ended. Witness the 1948 revolt in Guatemala, which the CIA finally admitted as to sponsoring. Consider Kennedy and the Bay of Pigs, Reagan and the Iran-Contras, and the presence of U.S. fighters under lock and key in Venezuela. Clearly fits a pattern. Several items contributed to the move against Cuba. In the early 1890s, Admiral Mahan published a very significant book on the importance of sea power, hence the need for the coaling stations. Vanderbilt had a very significant transportation company across Nicaragua as part of the California gold rush. Zinn talks of the U.S. overproduction in both industrial and agricultural commodities. Though slavery was over, the idea of more land to bring into cultivation appealed to parts of the business community. This was enough to encourage some of the leadership in going for another round of expansion. Most of the Spanish American colonies had gained freedom in the 18 teens and the 20s. Cuba was now in revolt against Spain in 1898. The United States business community already had investments in Cuba. There was some support in the United States for support of the revolutionaries in Cuba. This led to the battleship, actually it was more like a heavy cruiser, Maine, being sent to the Havana harbor. After a few days in port, the ship blew up. This was a spark for the newspapers industry to clamor for war. Since Zen published, it has been established in scientific discovery and archaeology that the Maine blew up due to the sparking of coal dust in the coal bunkers of their fuel. The explosion reflected on poor management on part of the crew of the ship, not on Spanish activity. However, the source was unknown at the time, so the clamor for war occupied the press. Spain was simply overmatched. The United States overcame what resistance there was. The US authorities also refused to recognize the revolutionaries in Cuba as being worthy to work with. The trip from the Philippines to Cuba by the battleship Oregon by way of Cape Horn gave support to a canal across the isthmus in Central America. Teddy Roosevelt got a leg up on his political career. During the war fracas, the Hawaiian Islands were brought aboard with the help of the Dole pineapple influence from their investment in that collection of islands. The US claimed the Philippines, though it took years to complete the conquest. The entrance of US industry into Cuba went quickly, not to be removed until Castro came to power some 60 years later. The United Fruit Company, for instance, acquired 1.9 million acres of land in Cuba as an example of the movement of US firms going to Cuba for cheap labor. There is no question that this situation continued in Cuba until Baptistas was disposed in 1959. We got our coaling station, which we still hold despite not using coal for the Navy in a century. One positive from the Cuban adventure was progress in public health. The battle against yellow fever resulted in the realization of hygienic conditions in the community, which had medical impact. Without this additional medical information, our Panama Canal project would have failed, just as did the French, with political implications there, which caused the fall of the French government. The behavior of the United States government toward the revolutionaries in Cuba was deplorable. The behavior toward the revolutionaries in the Philippines was simply reprehensible. The anti-Spanish movement for independence started in the Philippines in 1892, 6 years before the war broke out. This organization, called the First Philippine Republic, had almost completely freed the country of Spanish influence, except the main fleet in Manila Bay and a few urban centers before the Spanish-American War started. Independence from Spain was declared in June of 1898 by this independent Philippine revolutionary group. At about the same time, the United States did a double cross on the Philippine independence movement. General Arthur MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur's father, and other officers proceeded to not only refuse to recognize the new government, they brought in soldiers to, quote, bring order, unquote, to the replacement of the Spanish government. General Otis in command issued orders to kill all those in opposition to the US control. He clearly did not want any prisoners. The excesses of death were, by different estimates, for 200,000 and 1 million men, women, and children, both black and white United States soldiers, wrote back home complaining of this horrible treatment of the Philippine civilians. And a significant number of these letters were published in newspapers. General Otis's response to this unfavorable publicity was to order the court-martial of those soldiers, telling the folks back home what was actually going on. It is believed this original orders on this subject may have been illegal. Guerrilla warfare began in late 1899, continuing formally until April 1902. The American atrocities continued throughout the following years until in 1913, when some semblance of peace was restored. Mark Twain, who was in opposition to the war, declared that, quote, "Our uniformed troops are assassins," unquote. For a final insult to the common soldiers in this mess in the Philippines, the War Department denied the usual governmental benefits for veterans of war activity, as the Philippine insurrection was not recognized as a war. End of lecture, and thank you very much.